Malawi didn't just vote. It protested through the ballot box. When results came in and it became clear that Lazarus Chakwera's government had been voted out, the reaction across the country wasn't shock. It was relief, a deep collective exhale. The kind of silence that follows after years of frustration, empty promises, and an economy gasping for air. It wasn't a coup, it wasn't chaos, it was democracy doing what democracy does best: course correction. And if there's one thing Malawians have proven again and again, it's that their patience has a limit, especially when hope turns into hunger and leadership sounds more like poetry than policy. So today on Global Pulse News, we're unpacking 10 brutally honest reasons why Malawians voted out Lazarus Chakwera's government. From corruption to confusion, from promises to power cuts, with a good dose of truth, a sprinkle of wit, and that unmistakable Malawian realism that says, we've seen worse, but this we couldn't take anymore. Let's start where it all began, with the promises that inspired a nation and then vanished faster than fuel at a filling station. When Lazarus Chakwera first took office, Malawi was buzzing with optimism. The streets of Lilongwe, Blantyre, and Mzuzu echoed with hope. People genuinely believed that this time, change was coming. The Tonse Alliance had promised transparency, accountability, job creation, and a government that would finally put the people first. For a nation long weighed down by political disappointments, Chakwera's eloquence sounded refreshing. His speeches were powerful, his words persuasive. He quoted scripture, invoked unity, and promised to lead with moral clarity. For many, he was the pastor president who would clean up corruption and guide Malawi toward fairness and reform. But as months turned into years, Malawians started realizing that the sermons were louder than the solutions. Instead of transformation, they got long speeches. Instead of jobs, they got explanations. Instead of reform, they got reshuffling. When Chakwera vowed to end corruption, people clapped. But when the scandals began surfacing inside his own circle, people stopped clapping and started counting. Each unfulfilled promise chipped away at trust. From fuel shortages to maize price hikes, from public sector inefficiency to empty political reform talk, Malawians started asking, where's the change we voted for? It became clear that what began as Tonse Vision 2063 was turning into Tonse Confusion 24/7. The same public that had once carried him into State House began whispering that maybe the difference between Chakwera's administration and the old regimes was only in vocabulary. Trust, the foundation of any democracy, was gone. And once a Malawian voter loses faith, even the most powerful pastor can't preach it back. But broken promises were just the appetizer. The real political indigestion came when corruption became the main course, served hot and repeatedly right from within the House of Government itself.
If there's one thing that can destroy a government faster than inflation or incompetence, it's corruption that walks boldly, unashamed, and seemingly untouchable. And under Chakwera's administration, that's exactly what many Malawians saw. The Anti-Corruption Bureau, or ACB, turned into Malawi's busiest office, almost a national drama theater. Every week, there seemed to be a new case, a new arrest, a new revelation, ministers being investigated, procurement scandals emerging, and contracts that raised more eyebrows than benefits. Chakwera came in promising a zero-tolerance policy. He said corruption would be fought without fear or favor. But as the scandals began multiplying, the slogan began to sound like a bedtime story. Nice words, no action. When he suspended some officials, citizens cheered briefly, but when others were quietly reinstated or when key investigations stalled mysteriously, the cheering turned into disbelief. The perception became dangerous that corruption wasn't being fought, it was being managed. And in Malawi, perception is power. When people begin to feel that the rich and connected can do as they please while ordinary citizens are told to tighten belts, the social contract collapses. Even worse, international donors began raising eyebrows. reports of misused funds and slow accountability scared away trust and investment. And once that happens, the economy starts coughing. Malawians began saying openly in markets and minibuses, "This government is eating while we are starving." It wasn't just about stolen money, it was about stolen hope. The very promise that Chakwera built his leadership on, integrity, became the thing people stopped believing in. And when your biggest selling point becomes your biggest scandal, you've already lost the election. The rest is just paperwork. But if corruption cracked the walls, what truly brought the house tumbling down was the economic storm that followed, a crisis that turned everyday survival into a luxury. Let's talk about money, or more accurately, the lack of it. Because during Chakwera's final years in power, the average Malawian wallet was emptier than a petrol station after payday. The economy wasn't just struggling, it was gasping for oxygen. Prices shot up, salaries stood still, and inflation danced like it had no curfew. The kwacha became weaker than promises at a campaign rally, and for most families, every shopping trip felt like gambling against the cost of living. Maize prices doubled, fuel became a national heartbreak. Even basic commodities like sugar and cooking oil turned into luxury items. The government blamed global markets, supply chains, and external pressures. And yes, those factors mattered, but for Malawians facing daily reality, excuses don't fill the plate. Street vendors complained that customers disappeared, civil servants quietly took side hustles, and taxi drivers parked cars because fuel costs ate profits. It was a collective economic exhaustion. Meanwhile, the government continued to host summits and issue speeches full of strategic frameworks and recovery roadmaps. But to ordinary citizens, those sounded like riddles. What people wanted was relief, not PowerPoint slides. Malawi's hardworking population reached its breaking point. As one Blantyre trader famously said in a radio interview, "We are tired of surviving like statistics. We want to live like citizens." When an administration fails to ease economic pain, it doesn't just lose votes, it loses faith. And that's exactly what happened. And just when Malawians thought things couldn't get any worse, the leadership itself began to look like it needed a reboot, running on fumes and overpromises.
By the third year of Lazarus Chakwera's administration, the excitement that once electrified Malawi had turned into quiet frustration, the kind you could feel in every market conversation, every taxi debate, every late-night radio call-in show. The tone had changed. People began saying, "He means well, but..." And in politics, that "but" is the sound of confidence slipping away. Chakwera's leadership, once viewed as calm and composed, started to appear slow, bureaucratic, and uninspired. His speeches, beautifully written and filled with scripture, began to feel repetitive, almost recycled. Each new scandal or crisis was met with a promise to review, to reflect, or to reform. But review doesn't put food on the table. Reflection doesn't stabilize fuel prices. And reform never arrived. Behind the scenes, even some within his party started expressing concern. They said the president was too trusting, too patient, and too focused on words instead of decisive action. Others described his leadership as gentle when the country needed steel. Ordinary Malawians felt that the government had lost touch, that it was living in a policy bubble far removed from the streets of Naronde or Mazimba. While people queued for fuel and power outages darkened homes, State House remained stuck in meetings and task forces. At that point, perception became reality. Chakwera, once seen as a reformer, now looked like a lecturer giving speeches to a class that had stopped listening. And when the people stop listening, you stop leading, even if you're still president. But if leadership fatigue was the slow leak in the tire, the alliance breakdown was the nail that made sure the vehicle couldn't move any further. Ah, yes, the famous Tonse Alliance. the grand coalition that was supposed to unite Malawi under a single purpose. It began as a political love story. Chakwera's MCP teaming up with Salos Chilima's UTM, joined by a chorus of smaller parties all singing about reform, unity, and national renewal. At first, it was beautiful, Malawi's version of a political wedding. But, as every Malawian knows, some marriages don't survive the honeymoon. Once power was secured, harmony turned into competition. Who controlled which ministry, who got credit for which project, and who was sidelined when decisions were made? Those questions quietly poisoned the relationship. Publicly, they smiled. Privately, they disagreed. By midterm, the alliance looked more like an awkward co-parenting arrangement than a government. MCP loyalists accused UTM of being ungrateful. UTM members accused MCP of betrayal. Smaller alliance partners complained they'd been reduced to background dancers in a show they helped produce. Chilima, once hailed as the energetic face of the new Malawi, gradually distanced himself from key decisions, especially as corruption allegations and internal power plays emerged. The promise of shared governance turned into shared frustration. And Malawians? They saw it all. They saw a divided government pretending to be united. They saw internal egos hijacking national priorities. And they knew, if the leaders can't agree within themselves, how can they fix the nation? The alliance that once symbolized unity became a daily reminder of dysfunction. It wasn't a government in motion, it was a coalition in confusion. And when voters sense division, they don't pick sides. They reject the whole thing. But while leaders were fighting over ministries, Malawians were fighting for survival. Because the real disconnect wasn't political, it was human.
If there's one thing Malawians value, it's a leader who feels their pain, not one who just talks about it in metaphors. And somewhere between State House and the dusty markets, Lazarus Chakwera's government lost that connection. In the beginning, his calm tone and preacher's delivery inspired faith. But as the crises multiplied, that same tone began to sound distant, like a sermon delivered from the clouds. People wanted empathy that could touch the ground. They wanted a leader who could stand in the market, feel the dust, and speak their language, not just quote scripture from the podium. When floods hit the Lower Shire, victims waited days for visible leadership. When farmers complained about fertilizer shortages, they got promises instead of products. When students protested poor job prospects, they got speeches about long-term solutions. It was all words, no warmth. Malawians aren't unreasonable. They don't expect miracles, but they expect presence. And presence, that simple act of showing up, listening, engaging, is what Chakwera's government stopped doing. Instead, communication became formal, scripted, and filtered through officials who didn't always tell him the truth. In a nation that values humility and accessibility, the image of a distant government felt like betrayal. The same citizens who once saw him as a people's president began whispering that he'd become just another politician, polished, polite, and painfully out of touch. Once the connection between a leader and the led breaks, repairing it takes more than a speech. It takes sincerity. Unfortunately, by the time that realization hit, the political clock had already run out. But while one generation was disconnecting, another was dialing in, and Malawi's youth were about to teach the old guard a very modern political lesson. Forget everything you know about traditional Malawian politics, because this election wasn't fought in rallies or radio call-ins. It was fought on TikTok, Twitter, WhatsApp, and YouTube. Malawi's youth, restless, vocal, and tech-savvy, decided they'd had enough of politics that felt like reruns. They wanted jobs, progress, and digital opportunities, not long speeches and slow reforms. For years, governments underestimated their power, but in 2025, that mistake came back to bite hard.
Young voters organized online campaigns, mobilized friends, and flooded the internet with memes, commentary, and hard facts. They became watchdogs with Wi-Fi, calling out hypocrisy, tracking corruption, and sharing every broken promise like breaking news. Chakwera's administration, slow to adapt, failed to capture that new generation's imagination. While his team issued statements, the youth were making content. While ministers discussed future policies, young people were already live streaming their frustration. Even more powerful was the tone. This wasn't angry rebellion, it was witty defiance. Hashtags like "We Vote for Action" and "Enough Tonse Talk" trended across platforms. Satirical videos mocking the government's inefficiency went viral, turning frustration into creative protest. For the first time, young Malawians proved that digital democracy wasn't just a slogan, it was a force. They refused to be passive observers of failure. They became narrators of change. And when election day arrived, they turned likes into votes. This was Malawi's generational awakening. A youth revolution fought not with stones or slogans, but with smartphones and conviction. But while the youth rewrote politics online, the headlines offline were still dominated by one thing: scandal after scandal, like a political TV series that refused to end.
If corruption was the disease, then scandal was the recurring fever that refused to break. Under Chakwera's government, it felt like every few weeks brought a new headline, a new gate, a new inquiry, another "we are investigating" press conference. It became a pattern so predictable that Malawians began saying, "This government doesn't need a calendar, it has a scandal schedule." From procurement irregularities to dubious appointments, from contract favoritism to funds that vanish faster than electricity during load shedding, the nation watched in disbelief. Each case blurred into the next until the line between mistake and malpractice became indistinguishable. Chakwera tried to present himself as the reformer within the storm, suspending officials, setting up committees, and calling for accountability. But Malawians had seen this movie before. They wanted results, not reviews. They wanted convictions, not press statements. One of the biggest criticisms was inconsistency. When allies were accused, investigations moved slower than traffic in Lilongwe. When opponents were implicated, justice moved like a race car. The double standard became obvious and dangerous. As the 2025 elections approached, even die-hard supporters began quietly distancing themselves. Civil servants whispered that they'd rather keep their heads down than defend a government that seemed allergic to consequences. It wasn't just about corruption anymore, it was about credibility. Every administration in Malawi's history had faced scandals, yes, but Chakwera's team had promised moral leadership. When that moral high ground crumbled, there was nothing left to stand on. And in the court of public opinion, once the people start laughing at your excuses instead of listening to them, you've already lost. But if Malawians were tired of scandal fatigue, nothing drained their patience or their phone batteries like the endless blackouts that followed. You know things are bad when load shedding stops being a schedule and becomes a lifestyle. Under Chakwera's government, the national energy crisis became one of the most visible symbols of dysfunction. Power cuts struck homes, schools, hospitals, and businesses with ruthless consistency. Every Malawian could recite Eskom's excuses by heart: maintenance, weather, technical challenges, or the favorite one, generation imbalance. But what it really meant was no lights, no fridge, no progress. Businesses bled money, students studied under candles, hospitals scrambled to run generators. The very rhythm of life dimmed, literally. And every blackout became another reminder that leadership was not delivering where it mattered most: infrastructure. When voters went to the polls, they didn't just want light in their homes, they wanted light in their government. And when the ballot boxes opened, they made sure to switch off the source of the darkness. But even as the lights went out across the country, one faint glow remained: the hope that maybe, just maybe, Malawi could still rise again under new leadership.
By the final stretch of Chakwera's presidency, one thing was painfully clear. Malawians weren't angry anymore. They were tired. And in politics, tired is more dangerous than angry, because anger still means you care. Tired means you've given up. The Tonse dream that once felt like a promise of rebirth had slowly turned into déjà vu. People who had chanted change in 2020 were now shaking their heads, saying, "We've seen this movie before." Chakwera's eloquence no longer inspired. It exhausted. Every fellow Malawian speech became a trigger for memes. Every reform announcement felt like a recycled script. Even his once strong alliance partners had grown cold, focusing on their survival instead of defending the man who'd once unified them. Into that vacuum stepped familiar faces, opposition figures like Peter Mutharika, who seized the opportunity like a seasoned chess player. He painted himself as the strong hand Malawi needed again, a leader who could restore order and clean up the mess. Whether people believed him or not didn't matter. They believed less in Chakwera, and that was enough. Meanwhile, smaller opposition voices, younger, bolder, digitally fluent, started gaining traction too. They spoke the language of action, not excuses. They talked about innovation, entrepreneurship, and real accountability. It was as if a new generation of political thinking was rising from the ashes of disillusionment. When the ballots were finally counted, the message was deafeningly clear. Malawi wasn't voting for a new leader. It was voting for a new attitude. Chakwera's government hadn't lost because people hated him. It lost because people stopped believing he could fix what he started. And in the quiet after the election, one could almost feel the nation whisper, "We gave you a chance. You gave us speeches. We gave you power. You gave us patience. Now we're giving someone else a turn." That's not rage. That's democracy. Malawian style. When history looks back on this chapter, it will see a lesson, not just for Lazarus Chakwera, but for every leader who thinks eloquence can outlast performance. Malawians, gentle but wise, patient but sharp, have once again proven that democracy here isn't just a word, it's a heartbeat. A heartbeat that may slow down under disappointment, but never stops. They reminded the continent that no government owns power forever, and no slogan can replace delivery. Chakwera's fall wasn't a tragedy, it was accountability in motion, the kind that defines a maturing democracy. And maybe, just maybe, that's what Malawi needed all along. A reminder that leadership is borrowed and the people always take it back when it's misused. So what do you think? Did Malawians vote out Chakwera because of corruption, economic fatigue, or pure disappointment? Or was it simply democracy catching up with delayed promises? Drop your thoughts below and don't hold back. Keep it honest, keep it sharp, and keep it Malawian. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share it with your friends. Because here at Global Pulse News, we don't just break headlines, we decode the pulse behind them. Until next time, this is your host signing off, reminding you that in Malawi, leadership may fade, but accountability never sleeps.